What does this mean? Well, the meaning of the word is not in doubt at all. Renaissance, rebirth. It's not a word that was in common use during the 15th and 16th centuries at all. True, it was used perhaps by a man called Giorgio Vasari, who wrote the Lives of the Artists in 1550, second edition 1568, where he said there had been a rebirth, a rinascimento, as he would have named it. But even then, it did not come into popular usage until the end of the 19th century. When the National Gallery was founded, for example, in 1824, they would have talked about old master painters and the primitives, the people who really weren't up to much. And this is actually following on from what Giorgio Vasari said, which was sort of commonly understood belief that after the fall of the Roman Empire, everything had gone into disarray. The arts in particular had got rather dreadful. And when Vasari sat down to write his Lives of the Artists in the 1550s, well, in the 1540s, publishing, as I say, 1550, the first edition, he said, well, I've grouped the artists into three, really. The first group really weren't very good, actually, but at least they were better than the lot that went before. The second group, I would say, were as good as nature. And the third group, leading up to the present day, are even better than nature. Now, in a way, with this statement, he invents the history of art, because he invents the idea of progress, things gradually getting better. But there is a common misapprehension about this. He does not say that art is getting more and more naturalistic. Because after all, the second group of people are naturalistic. The third group are better than nature, which means they're not naturalistic. They are more exaggerated, they're more arty, they are more artificial, let's face it. Now, I suppose if we wanted to pin down our contemporary categories for that, they might be Gothic, early Renaissance, high Renaissance. But really, it's not worthwhile trying to split things down like that. So when did we start using the word Renaissance? In a way, it goes back to 1860. A Swiss man called Jakob Burckhardt wrote a book called De Renaissance der Kultur in Italien, which was translated into English in 1878 as the civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. And it is really from that point onwards that we start using this word. What does it mean? Well, Renaissance, rebirth, the rebirth of culture after the fall from the Roman Empire. We live in far more enlightened times now, and we know that the Dark Ages were not quite as dark as we thought. There were wonderful, beautiful, enlightened artistic products, great works of literature, etc., etc., etc. But that's the name it's got, and that's what we're talking about. When did it start? All of these questions, quite frankly, there's no answer to. It evolves gradually, it emerges. But certainly in terms of my book, I would say that the focus on the Renaissance in Italy would be the 15th century and the first half of the 16th century. But there are little hints going back, right back to the beginning of the 14th century, for example. After all, if you're going to spot a Renaissance work of art, what are you going to look for? Well, reborn. What are they using for the rebirth? Well, the classical civilizations, Greece and Rome. Not always the artistic, the visual artistic materials, but the writings. And this is one of the things. Gradually they were rediscovering classical texts. They'd been around for a long time. They were in the libraries, in the monasteries, for example. The monks had their hands on them. Occasionally they read them. And they read in that as much as anything. And you find this with Boccaccio, actually. He starts writing about famous people, and he looks back to the classical authors and notes that some people become famous, artists become famous because they are better than other artists. And so that discourse comes into public discourse about the arts, and what does better mean after all? The other thing is a sense of order and structure which starts to develop. And so when I start this book, there's a little introductory section. saying some ideas of the Renaissance, and I use two key images, the Mona Lisa and Michelangelo's David. Why do I use those? Well, because they're familiar things. They're things people want to know slightly more about. But I talk about looking more in the Renaissance towards naturalism, actually, and so the idea of portraiture and what a person actually looks like. And the Mona Lisa is a very good example of that. But also particularly the way that in the Renaissance, mankind looks more towards mankind than towards God, in a way. A very important text was written by a man called Leon Battista Alberti in the 1430s. He was writing on painting, and he called his book, fortunately enough, On Painting. And one of the things he says is, since Protagoras says, man is the mode and measure of all things, which is great, we just don't know who he was talking about. But man as the measure of all things is quite important, and man as nobility. I say man, obviously, we'd like to say woman as well, but most of these books were written by men, so I use man as mankind here. The nobility of man, and this is one of the reasons, of course, for using Michelangelo's David, one of the prime examples of that. But of course, one of the remarkable things about that particular sculpture is it was not created as a work of art in its own right. It is a tiny piece of decoration in that it was intended to go on the roof of the Cathedral of Florence, one of many sculptures that was meant to go on the roof. And when you see it, you think, they can't all have been as good as that. And that was the point. When he finished it, it was so good, they thought, well, he can't put it up there, nobody will see it. And in fact, none of the others were ever made in the end. But David, a figure from the Jewish scriptures, who the Christians interpret as one of the prophets of the coming Messiah, is up there, would have been up there on the cathedral, announcing the arrival of the Messiah, whose arrival is celebrated within the body of the building. So in a way, they would all have been up there outside shouting, Jesus is coming, get in here. That's what they were up there to do. They had a function. I said decoration, it would have been decorative, but there was a meaning behind it as well. Now this leads into an introductory section in which I look at the different genres and what happened to the different genres of culture. And actually I start with literature rather than the visual arts, partly because that is so important, so influential. Dante's Divine Comedy, for example. It's a midlife crisis, he went to hell and back. It's that simple. And he goes through this journey, first of all, through hell, then through purgatory, and then up through heaven to the throne of heaven and God himself. 3 books, which are made up of 33 cantos, sort of long chapters effectively, but there's one introductory canto which leads up to the overall number of 100. So the idea of symmetry is quite important within the literature. Similarly, Boccaccio, who writes the Decameron, there's a plague in Florence, and it was hugely influential, the Black Death across the whole of Europe. And in the Decameron, 10 people head out into the countryside for 10 days to get away from the plague. And on each day, they each tell a story. 10 times 10 is 100. So you get that same idea of order and symmetry. Look at the development of painting, very briefly. The development of sculpture and of architecture in that period. And one of the buildings I pick out, of course, is Florence Cathedral. They knew from the second half of the 14th century what it was going to look like. They'd started building from the ground up. The master builder had made a model of what it would look like. There's even a painting from the 1370s of what it would have looked like. The only thing is they got to about 1419 and thought, well, that's fine, we know what the dome's going to look like, we just don't know how to build it. And it was Brunelleschi who worked out that engineering challenge. And this is another thing, a great advance in engineering and building which feeds into the Renaissance. The reliance on classical forms, not just in terms of literature and what they learned from literature and what the ancients said about ancient art. This feeds through to sculpture. For example, they talk about sculptures in terracotta, and that was a whole genre of sculpture which was really invented during the Renaissance. Medals, they took Roman coins and looked at them and invented the genre of the commemorative medal, for example, a new genre in the Renaissance. That it was typical to put a bust of the household owner outside, and they carved busts to do that. And there are one or two Renaissance portrait busts that were so badly weathered nowadays, we can more or less tell that they must have sat outside the front doors of various houses. But they also relied on classical form. One of the paintings I refer to, for example, is the Birth of Venus. It's a very famous painting by Botticelli, where Venus is standing on a shell in the middle. On the left-hand side, there are two winds blowing her to shore, and somebody standing on the shore ready to clothe her. Now, nobody had ever painted that before, so it's absolutely fascinating to know how Botticelli knew what to paint. Well, one of the things he did is, for Venus herself, he took the classical sculpture Venus Pudica, standing there covering herself. Of course, that's slightly deceptive, because she's never covering herself terribly well. And of course, what she's really doing is going, OK, guys, look at those bits. And they're not hidden in any way whatsoever. But Botticelli adopts that as the form for his Venus. But he must also have relied on contemporary texts. A man called Poliziano, for example, who was employed by Lorenzo de' Medici to educate his children, wrote texts describing the bronze doors of Venus's house on Cyprus. This is pure imagination. But he created what's called an ekphrasis, which is a verbal description of a visual image. And he uses words to evoke in your mind's eye what it would have been like. And he says you can see her stepping onto the ground and people reaching out to clothe her. And as she steps onto the ground, the flowers starting to bloom on the ground as her foot touches it. Now, this is just one of the things which influences Botticelli's painting of the Birth of Venus. It's so famous, I'm sure you've got it in your head anyway. But one of the things that Ernst Gombrich pointed out way back, I think, in the 1960s, was that in most paintings people have a model. If you look at any painting of the Annunciation, for example, you've got the angel Gabriel turning up, saying to the Virgin Mary, you're going to be the Mother of God. And so you have the angel Gabriel, you have the Virgin Mary, quite often you have the dove of the Holy Spirit, and that's really all you need. After that, it's theme and variations. I always think these paintings are rather like cover versions of songs. I don't know if you've got a particularly favourite song that you like, and then you hear a cover version and you think, oh, that's not as good as the last one, is it? I preferred that. But the tune's the same, the words are the same, what's different? Well, it's the backing track, the rhythms are different, the orchestration's different. And all Annunciations are like that. The words are the same, the tune's the same, it's just the backing track's different. You might get the hand of God coming in, you might have an arcade, they might be outside, they might be inside. They'll be in slightly different positions, but they're playing with tradition. Now, for Botticelli, painting the Birth of Venus, there was no tradition. So what did he do? Well, this is what Gombrich pointed out. He went to another painting where you have somebody standing in the middle naked, somebody with wings, two people with wings on one side, and somebody else on the other side leaning over. And in fact, he took the baptism of Christ, with two angels with wings holding Christ's robe, John the Baptist leaning over to pour the water over his head, and Jesus in his loincloth in the middle. So next time you have a look at the Birth of Venus, just think, that's actually the baptism of Christ. And that's the moment at which the Renaissance has really arrived. When they are not adopting, he does adopt a classical form, the Venus Pudica, but for Venus. He's not adopting it for a Christian subject, he's using a Christian form for a classical subject. So the interest in classical subject matter is absolutely vital. The development of perspective, which is developed by Brunelleschi in around 1415, single vanishing point perspective. But actually Giotto, way back in 1305, could create a really good impression of space just by using his eye. And even if they were quoting from classical sculptures and architecture to a certain extent in the 15th century, you can find people like Nicola Pisano doing that in the font in Pisa Baptistry, way back in the 1350s, so that happens before. Psychological depth is another thing. The fact that in the Renaissance you can see people thinking, just think of Michelangelo's David again, for example. All other sculptures of David had shown him with one foot on Goliath's head, so you knew he'd already defeated Goliath. In Michelangelo's David, he's standing there going, where's that giant? And there's the sense of the furrowed brow, there's a sense of worry, and a sort of psychological drama that you don't know when the giant's going to turn up, where he is, and whether David's going to succeed. You know he's going to succeed, spoiler alert, he kills the giant. So a lot of the ideas, the individual things, we go, is this Renaissance? Perspective, tick. Using classical past, tick. Light and shade to model things in 3 dimensions. Well, yes, Masaccio. And you can see it in the Pisa Madonna, as it's called, the Madonna and Child with Angels, which is in the National Gallery. You can see that the light is coming from the top left, coming down. The little sort of rosettes on the throne, Mary sitting on, cast shadows down that way. Even the angels sitting on the floor, the lutes they have do that. They're in light and shade. Giotto had used that, not quite as coherently, in fact. And also there's a real sense of suffering in Giotto's angels, in his Lamentation over the Dead Christ in Pisa, for example. So a lot of the ideas had been around, but they gradually all gelled together when you get to the Renaissance. So how do you put all this together? It is only the Italian Renaissance, so it's only one country, but nevertheless, I am using art starting in approximately 1300 up to about 1580. That's a lot to get into one book. So I've broken it down. The first section, if I said, looks at some of the ideas behind the major genres of art. So literature, painting, sculpture, architecture, and the decorative arts, because that's hugely important. We tend to separate them now. The tapestries which Raphael designed for the Sistine Chapel, for example, the cartoons for those tapestries are in the Victoria and Albert Museum now. The tapestries themselves, well, the original ones are in the Vatican museums, and there's one, for example, of St. Paul preaching in Athens. And to show it's Athens, he has a sculpture of Mars. The Bible said he was on Mars Hill, for example. Ares, if you want to be accurate for the Greeks. But also a classical building, and there is a round temple there to show you he is in Athens. But actually, what Raphael did was he copied Bramante's little Tempietto, which was a building dating to 1504. And it was such a good building, a good Renaissance building which evoked the classical past. Not only was it not called the Little Chapel, it was called the Little Temple, Tempietto, but Raphael chose it to illustrate Athens just 10 years later, really. So the decorative arts were hugely important. They weren't separated. All of these things lived together in the same space. And art, as art with a capital A, didn't really exist. There weren't really any art galleries. There were collections, yes, but there weren't really any art galleries until the 18th century. So the second main section of the book deals with what I call the language of the Renaissance. And I pick out certain themes, things like perspective, for example, to have a proper look at that. But the first one I take is objects and their meanings. And there are 2 works of art I use to illustrate that. One is another painting from the National Gallery called the Madonna della Rondine, the Virgin of the Swallow. This little swallow perched up on the back of the throne. And that's because swallows go away and come back again. Now we know they migrate. Back then they thought they lived in holes in riverbanks during the winter. But nevertheless they went away and came back, a bit like Jesus, who went away and came back. So the swallow is a symbol of the resurrection. That's what it's doing there. And there's lots of fruit there, and I took about the symbolism of that. But there's also, on the left-hand side, to the left of the throne, there's a man standing there in a long red robe and a broad-brimmed red hat. He is a cardinal. He's holding a book, Bible presumably, with a church on top. It is St. Jerome who translated the Bible into Latin. It was in so many different languages. Well, 3, basically. But sometimes the Greek had got translated into Latin, sometimes the Aramaic had got translated into Greek, and that had got translated into Latin, and it was all a bit confused. So he went back to the original languages, translated it all into a uniform Latin, and that Bible is still today the official Bible of the Roman Catholic Church, the Vulgate Bible. And that's why he has the books, That's why he has the church, because of the work he did for the church, and in fact he becomes one of the fathers of the church. But he also has standing next to him a little lion, which has got its paw raised up like that. And if you look very carefully, there's a thorn going through it. And that's because a story of St. Jerome was, towards the end of his life, he retired to a monastery in Bethlehem, and he heard all the monks shouting around outside, and he came out and said, "What's the matter?" And the monk said, "There's a big lion, it's going to kill us all." And Jerome said, "I don't think God would allow that, quite frankly. I better have a word with this lion." So he goes out, and the lion rushes up to him and goes, "Ah!" He said, "Well, no wonder it's upset. There's a big thorn in its paw." He takes out the thorn. The lion is so grateful it stays with him for the rest of its life and has adventures on its own, as it happens. That's another story. So what you could say from that is that a lion is a symbol of Saint Jerome. Yes, it is. But a lion can also be a symbol of something else. And the other image I have in that particular section is a sculpture called the Marzocco. And the Marzocco is a lion standing there with its paw on a shield which has a lily on it, one of the symbols of Florence, one of the flowers of Florence, the main flower of Florence, the lily. And the Marzocco is a symbol of Florence. It probably takes its name from Mars, the god of war, and it could be that the Marzocco stood where there had been, in classical times, a sculpture of Mars at the end of a bridge going over the Arno. There had been a medieval lion in the town square of Florence, what is now called the Piazza della Signoria. And it had a little verse on it. It wore a little gold crown. It had a little verse saying, "Corona porto per la patria degna, a ciò che ciascun libertà mantegna." I wear this crown for the worthy fatherland, so that everyone will maintain its liberty. It was a symbol of Republican Florence. Now that medieval lion got worn away eventually and was replaced with Donatello's, which had been made for a stair post in a monastery once upon a time. There's a replica in the town square now. So a lion might mean Florence, but a lion might mean Sir Jerome if it's standing next to a man with a long red robe and a broad-brimmed red hat. That would tell you that cardinal is Jerome rather than any other cardinal. Actually, if you saw a lion with a pair of wings, it would mean St. Mark, as anybody who's been to Venice would know, because there are winged lions all over the place. So the problem with symbolism, it is contextual. Another one of these little sections in the second section of the book is called symbols and or emblems and abbreviations. One of the emblems I look at is the diamond. The Medici adopted the diamond ring as one of their emblems, along with a little ribbon which had written on it the word sempre, always. Basically, the Medici wrote the lyric, "Diamonds are forever." It's that simple, because they were hard, brilliant, and they thought their power was going to last forever. It didn't, but there we go, that's the way of the world. And so the diamond becomes one of their symbols, and in this particular section I illustrate it with a tomb which is in the church of San Lorenzo. It is the tomb of two people, Piero and Giovanni de' Medici, which was commissioned by Piero's two sons, Lorenzo the Magnificent and Giuliano de' Medici. It's a very clever tomb because it's two-sided. So it's a tomb monument for two people, commissioned by two people, and it has two sides. It's in an archway with a big bronze net going through it, and on the white arch there are diamonds at the top on either side. And then the sarcophagus itself, they're actually buried in the vault underneath, but never mind. The sarcophagus itself has a big diamond on it as well. And so I use that to illustrate that, but I also use it in the next section, which is about colour. Now, colour symbolism is remarkably tricky, but going back to that particular monument, it's worthwhile pointing that the arches are carved out of a white marble, whereas the body of the sarcophagus itself is made out of red porphyry, and underneath that, laid into the bottom, there is green serpentine. So the colours red, white and green. They're probably very familiar, they're the colour of the Italian flag. But of course Italy didn't exist until 1870, let's say for shorthand. They were the colours of the Medici family. They were the colours of the Gonzaga family as well, actually, in Mantua, and the Este and Ferrara. Lots of families used them. This is one of the reasons why they end up as the Italian flag. but also theologically. In the Divine Comedy, when Dante gets to the throne of God, there are 3 steps leading up to the throne, and they are white, green and red, and they are labelled faith, hope and charity. And so white, green and red become the colours of the 3 theological virtues as they're known: faith, hope and charity. Another one of those refers to layers of meaning. I will explain to you why I'm picking out these ones in particular in just a moment. And in terms of layers of meaning, it's the way that images do change their meaning, but within that there's an illustration, also from the National Gallery, of a portrait of a soldier. He's in armour, he's drawing a sword. Now in the background of the painting there is a townscape, 3 arches, a loggia, and a big palace on the corner. And anybody familiar with Florence would recognise that as the Piazza della Signoria in Florence. And at the front corner of that palace, there is a little lion. It is the original Marzocco, but also the sculpture of David. Because David may have been carved to go on the roof of the cathedral to announce the arrival of Christ, but David, as the innocent shepherd boy who defeated the giant, becomes a symbol of the virtue of the small city of Florence, the Republic of Florence, which at the beginning of the 15th century defeated Milan, a very powerful force. So David becomes a symbol of Republican Florence. This becomes particularly important after the Medici are thrown out. So this soldier drawing his sword has next to him the little Marzocco, but also the David, both of them symbols of Republican Florence. So it looks as if he is defending the Florentine Republic. As far as I know, that's my theory. I don't think you'll find it in a catalogue in the National Gallery. Sadly, we don't know who he is. Another one deals quite simply with men and angels. And in terms of men, I make this quite simple point that buildings tend to be rectilinear. On the whole, you get a square shape, don't you? And so you want to decorate that. There's very often spaces in the corners. So if you've got 4 corners, it's quite useful to have 4 things to put in them. And there are 2 choices at this point. One, the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, or their symbols, and I've mentioned the winged lion for St. Mark already. The other 4 people you might get are the 4 fathers of the church. And they are people who are essential in defining the nature of the early church. I've already mentioned St. Jerome, and you can tell him by his broad-brimmed red hat and long red robe. There was also St. Gregory the Great, who gives us Gregorian chant. One of the things he did was to define what music would be used in the church. He was the Pope, and so he wears the triple tiara. Not all of this is strictly historical. After all, the role of cardinal didn't exist when Jerome was alive, but that's not an issue for the Renaissance artists. He was an advisor to the Pope, so he might just as well have been. The triple tiara, it looks a bit like a beehive with 3 crowns round it. That's how you tell a Pope. So that's Gregory the Great. And there's a wonderful Madonna and Child with the 4 fathers of the church, which is in the Accademia in Venice, used to illustrate this by 2 artists, one of them called Giovanni dalla Magna. Yes, John from Germany. And the other 2 are both bishops, which makes it a little bit tricky. St. Augustine and somebody else, can't quite remember at the moment, but doesn't really matter. And then finally, I'm going to mention the section on saints. And again, I use a painting from the National Gallery, The Coronation of the Virgin by Jacopo Diccioni, because it has 48 saints in it. It's quite a good dictionary of saints. And it has a rough symmetry. For example, on the right-hand side, you'll see a man in black and white holding a lily. That's St. Dominic. Equivalent to him, the other pillar of the church in the 14th century, in brown, St. Francis, with his rope belt with the 3 knots, representing the vow of chastity, poverty and obedience. So the second section is made up of all of, breaking it down into all of these elements, what I call the language of the Renaissance. And we get to the final section, which is called the Thematic Decoder, and in that I look at themes and take some really, really complex works of art. For example, there is one section on war and peace, and in that I use a not terribly well-known fresco by an artist called Ghirlanda. It should be brilliantly well-known. It's a beautiful fresco. It's in Santa Trinita in Florence, just at the end of the Santa Trinita bridge. So the bridge gets its name from the church, obviously. And what you see in it is a cityscape. And in the background you see a loggia with 3 arches and a big palace. It is set in Florence, this scene. Now, if you look into that, if you go to the Piazza della Signoria now, it's an open-air sculpture museum. There are sculptures absolutely everywhere. In the Granacci portrait of a soldier, the one drawing his sword, there are 2 sculptures, the Marzocco and the David. In this fresco, there's only 1 sculpture, the Marzocco, which tells you that this fresco was painted before 1504, which was when the David was completed and moved to its new site. So what all of the bits in section 2 do is lead you up to help explain what the big paintings in section 3. Now, at the foreground of that, so we're in Florence, it says, in the foreground of that, there's a man seated on the far right, wearing the triple tiara. He's the Pope, we know that already. In front of him is a man in a brown robe with a rope belt with 3 knots. It's St. Francis. And behind him 12 similarly dressed men. And this is the confirmation of the Franciscan rule. Anybody who knows theological history will know this did not happen in Florence. So what are they doing there? Well, it's interesting to note that the Pope is sitting there under a canopy, which is quite standard. It's a symbol of royalty, and the canopy has little loops hanging down, which are green, white and red. So is this saying faith, hope and charity, or is this saying the Medici family? Well, they're in Florence. And directly on our side of the Pope, who's sort of a historical character from the 13th century, you have the entirely contemporary to the fresco. The fresco is painted in the mid-1480s. Lorenzo de' Medici, the unofficial ruler of Florence, standing next to his main banker, a man called Francesco Sassetti. So, Francesco Sassetti, his name saint is St. Francis. His burial chapel has been decorated with stories from the life of St. Francis. That's why you've got the confirmation of the Franciscan rule there. And it comes at a point in Italian history where the Pope wanted to get his hands on some of Florence's territories, as did a lot of other people. They got together in what became known as the Pazzi Conspiracy, and in fact killed Giuliano de' Medici in the Cathedral of Florence. Lorenzo survived, but the Pope declared war on Florence. It lasted over a year, but eventually Lorenzo made peace with the King of Naples, who joined up with the side on the side of the Pope. And he got peace with Naples, and from that peace with Rome followed. And so one of the things this fresco celebrates is not the confirmation of the Franciscan rule. That is the theme, yes, but also layers of meaning. The fact that the Pope and the Medici are now friends again. And at the front, coming up the steps at the front of the fresco, going that way, you have Poliziano, the man who was so influential for the iconography, the development of the ideas behind the birth of Venus, leading the 3 sons of Lorenzo the Magnificent up, along with poets and other tutors, and leading them, I'm fairly convinced, is not the eldest son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, but the 2nd son, Giovanni de' Medici, who was what I think we would nowadays call a girly swat, and in fact ended up as the first Medici Pope, Pope Leo X. Now, this is just by way of explaining you how the book is put together. Everything in section 2 leads up to the more complicated ideas in section 3, hopefully teaching you the language of the Renaissance so that you can use it yourself when you get to the more complex imagery, ideas, buildings, etc., etc., etc. But trying to explain all of that in about half an hour is probably quite baffling. If you have any questions, thank you very much. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming. Yes.
So I've got 1.5 questions. You talked about Mars Hill, but I trying to understand which painting you're referring to. So just very briefly, but also, you know, there's a lot of talk about Renaissance art, like for example, the Last Supper, like lots of hidden meanings in it. Is that true? I mean, are there hidden meanings? If so, what are they in that painting?
Okay. So I don't know which was the one and which was the half a question, but the Mars Hill was actually a cartoon by Raphael for a tapestry now in the Vatican museums of St. Paul preaching, and it is on the Areopagus, which is Mars Hill, Ares, and it shows him on one side preaching. Behind him there's a sculpture of Mars which is turned away, and in the background there's the circular temple. So that was that painting, or painting stroke tapestry. Are there lots of meanings in the Last Supper? My most direct answer would be no. I don't think so. I mean, it's Jesus and his 12 disciples having dinner. And so the meanings, what's clever about it is he managed to get 2 or 3 episodes into it at the same time. And there are various things which are confusing. For example, in traditional Last Suppers, Judas would be on our side of the table, so he could make an easy getaway. Whereas in this, he's everybody is on the other side of the table. And he's quite close to St. Paul and St. John, St. Peter and St. John, St. Paul wasn't there. Whereas usually you would get St. Peter and St. John on either side of Jesus. Yes.
So looking at the Last Supper,
yes.
There's been an awful lot of stuff on the internet, you know, for at least 17 years. And the thing is, we have Jesus on one side, and then there's a sort of bead, and then there's the next apostle. Do you think that space was for Mary Magdalene?
No.
I think it was for Mary Magdalene.
Fine.
You don't think so?
No. I think it was a space because Jesus is God and everybody else was human. So yeah, no. There would be, she's not in any of the other paintings of the Last Supper, so I don't know why she would be in that one.
Well, women were, the men were the forefront, weren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's why I think she wouldn't have been there, I'm afraid. And there's lots of things in the book where I gradually work through why she isn't in that painting, actually. Including there's what's called the Mond crucifixion in the National Gallery, which has Mary Magdalene and John the Evangelist in, and John the Evangelist looks every bit as girly, that's the word I meant to say, as Mary Magdalene, and that's the thing, because there is the whole Da Vinci Code thing, but obviously that comes from whole other theories. And as a novel, he was just using that idea as a novel, that in fact in Leonardo's Last Supper that is Mary Magdalene in the painting next to Jesus. But no, John the Evangelist as a young man would have had long hair and wouldn't have had his hair covered. A respectable woman would have had her hair covered, and that's one of the problems, because Mary Magdalene was interpreted by the Roman Catholic Church as not being a respectable woman. But there's actually no... I know, and what I'm just saying is, there is absolutely nothing in the Bible to say that Mary Magdalene was a fallen woman. That was actually a decision by Gregory the Great in the 590s, that St. Luke's woman taken in adultery was the same as Mary Magdalene. So, yeah, it's not Mary Magdalene as a fallen prostitute is not biblical. That is the version of the Church as a whole, of the Roman Catholic Church. It was never the choice of the Orthodox Church in the East, for example. So, yes, but the fact is these are the paintings of the Catholic Church, rather than being somebody else's paintings. Yeah.
How did the thorn get in the lion's hand? And which hand was it?
Oh, how did the thorn get in the lion's hand? There's a very good thing that's worthwhile pointing out here, and that actually this story comes from classical myth. It's actually the story of Androcles and the lion, because stories move, and it's actually adopted by another saint before it's allocated to St. Jerome. And to be perfectly honest, there is no explanation in the story of how the Thorn got to be there. I mean,
Where are the Medici family now?
where are the Medici family now?
Yeah.
Well, they were powerful up until the 1730s, and then the last male Grand Duke of Tuscany was gay and didn't have any children. I mean, being gay never stopped people in history having children, it doesn't stop them now, but didn't have any children, and his sister just didn't. So they died out in Florence. I mean, they got sent into exile eventually. The last Medici drove out of Florence. And I'm not convinced, I don't think there are any of them left. Because in other families, there are branches of those families which survive, for example. I don't think there are any Medici around these days.
Okay, what happened to Renaissance?
The Baroque. Okay, what happened to the Renaissance? The Counter-Reformation happened to the Renaissance in a way. But this is where it starts getting difficult. This is where you have to read the next book, but I haven't written it yet. It develops, the Renaissance, because you have early Renaissance and high Renaissance. Some people say there's a style called mannerism, which I think does exist, mannerism, where things as they sound get very mannered. And it starts with, you could argue it starts with Michelangelo. You can argue it starts with Donatello, as it happens. But things go beyond. Okay, in his On Painting, Alberti says what you must try and do is tell the story as clearly as possible. Everything you do is towards a clear telling of the story. After a while, they can tell the story clearly. You get light, you get proportion, you get harmony, you get perspective, and everything lives within that space, and it tells the story clearly. You can place things perfectly, you can focus. But then art develops with a capital A in a way, and you realise some artists are better than others, and so you want to show off, not only I can paint a human well, but look at all the different things you can do with a human, and you can just make the bodies contort more and more until it gets less and less real, and the story gets less and less clear. Because you get more people than you need, you get flashes of light going here and there to just be impressive, you get perspectives which are more striking than naturalistically necessary, and so the story gets harder and harder to see, but it gets more and more artistically exciting. And when the Counter-Reformation comes along in the second half of the 16th century, the Church says, and this is from the Church's side of things, and they were the major patrons, yes, the Protestants are wrong. We must have images in our churches, but they must be large enough and clear enough for people to understand. And this shifted art away from mannerism into more like a sort of neo-Renaissance style, to something which was stripped back, more human, more personal, that we could understand. But from that, the real human drama starts to develop, and just being stripped back and plain is not necessarily that exciting. And they start to use drama more and more to grab your attention, and it develops into the Baroque, certainly by the time you get to 1600, arguably by 1590. But again, where something starts, where it ends, depends where you are, and it depends who you're looking at. So politics and religion evolved away from the Renaissance style being what was most relevant, would be the answer to that.